You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I'm really excited. My guest today is Margaret Shepherd. She's the writer of a new book on American calligraphy and actually has written multiple books on calligraphy, including Calligraphy for Beginners, which is about my level of expertise for it. So the perfect person to be talking to. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine because I really want to be capturing all sorts of art and art history. I mean, the history of art is the history of creativity across all cultures and all times through human existence. There's so much to capture, and I feel like I have not gotten a good enough hold on a lot of things with calligraphy. I mean, there's so much with the illuminated manuscripts and the Islamic calligraphy tradition that is so huge in art history. And I don't know why I'm even beginning to rattle these things off when I'm talking to the person who literally wrote the book or several books on calligraphy. But I'm really excited because this is an opportunity for me to learn a little bit more about an art form that I know a little bit about, but obviously not nearly as much as you. So thank you for coming on and taking the time to share your expertise.
You're welcome.
Now, it's interesting. Before we hit record, you started to mention the Kwak Waka Wak transformation mask. You said you were listening to a little bit of the back catalog. That is one of the 64 artworks in this year's Arts Madness tournament. And I don't know if you've listened or voted in that, but I want to remind my listeners, please go to whoartedpodcast.com/vote to vote for your favorites. I'm not sure if the transformation mask is still in it at this stage in the tournament, but I'm curious, Ms. Shepherd, if I could put you on the spot, do you have a favorite artwork in the tournament?
The Kwak Waka Wak transformation has what some art history historians call the most distinctive non-Western shape of any art system, that sort of oval, squashed circle. And we have it. It's in the Pacific Northwest, and I've made a whole alphabet out of it, even though they didn't have an alphabetic language. I feel like calligraphers can just kind of take up where Native American art left off.
Oh, that's so interesting. I love that connection to the Pacific Northwest. And I exactly know what you're talking about when you talk about those symbols that we see in a lot of those designs that come from the Pacific Northwest. Those tribal designs that we've seen from the indigenous people are absolutely beautiful. That's why that's part of the reason that I picked the Kwak Waka Wak transformation mask as a topic for this. And I find it so interesting that you're building calligraphy off of that. For listeners who are interested in learning more about calligraphy, check the links in the show notes. I will have links to your previous books and the current book that I believe is being released the day after we're recording this, but by the time this episode airs, it will already be out on sale on Amazon and everybody's favorite local bookstores and all of that.
Learn American Calligraphy, and it's part of my series, Learn Calligraphy and Learn World Calligraphy, where I kind of cover all of the history that's available to calligraphers, but always with the idea of making it accessible to beginners. Anybody can write for experts, but to write for a beginner, and especially a beginner who thinks they can't do it, is my specialty. And the reason a lot of people don't think they can do it is that their first experience, certainly the older generation, their first experience was being made to learn script writing, cursive writing. And so many people I talk to say, well, if that's what calligraphy is, I don't want it. And then they find out that calligraphy is all these other things, and they fall in love with it. But learning to write handwriting just is such a turnoff for a lot of people.
I'm vividly having flashbacks as you talk about that, because as a southpaw trying to learn to use the fountain pens, and I had to reverse everything that the teacher was doing, and the nibs didn't seem to like me, and it was just it was not the most pleasant experience of my youth, but yeah. I appreciate that you're breaking things down and making it. The key word I heard you say was accessible. So, you've got your series, Learn American Calligraphy is the latest book. And as I said, I'll link that in the show notes. But I do want to get a little bit now into you and your background. Can you just tell me, did you always like art? Did it come later? Like, what got you into the arts and wanting to be an artist and a calligrapher?
Well, I was one of those people who went into it with the best will in the world and came out in third grade hating handwriting. I thought, when you learn in first grade those beautiful letters called printing, I thought I could be happy just doing that my whole life. But cursive really turned me off. And it took me about 10 years to come back, pick up a different pen, a calligraphy pen, and realize that there was a whole world of beautiful Italic and Gothic and Celtic and Roman letters out there that nobody had ever introduced us to.
Yeah. So as a child, it sounds to me like you had kind of a similar experience with the frustration and the setbacks. And I got to say, I'm relating to that because I also, I was drawn to art because I struggled with it, and like just it frustrated me, but I couldn't walk away from it. So then what did bring you back to calligraphy? If you struggled with the handwriting or the cursive or whatever, what drew you ultimately to calligraphy, or where were you exposed to? I know you've already hinted at the different types of lettering, the Celtic and everything that you saw. Where did you see them? How did you encounter that, and how did it captivate you?
It sounds like you maybe had this same problem. Your eyes were better than your hand.
Yeah, definitely.
You liked the letters you saw, but when you tried to write them, you really didn't feel satisfied. And I felt the same way. I saw these beautiful letters around, and I couldn't make them because I wasn't properly taught. I wasn't given the stories behind them. I wasn't told where to go look them up. And I also was not told sort of the cultural background to something like Roman letters. That's whole 2,000 years of history. Kids can appreciate that. We're teaching them all these things about their history and their cultural legacy. They can figure out a Roman letter is 2,000 years old. All I got was an art teacher who said, oh, when you write Roman letters, don't make them all different sizes. And that was it.
Yeah.
Let's go look at a Roman letter. Let's see why they're all different from each other. Let's see how they looked 1,000 years later in the Middle Ages. I would have eaten that up. But at that point, nobody thought of calligraphy as an art. They just thought it was sort of a second-class craft, something you learned and then moved on from.
Yeah, if I'm being honest, for most of my life when I heard calligraphy, I know a lot of people think it's going to be some squiggly letters. I thought I'm going to smear some ink because the lefty in me was never that great at it. But one of the things I heard you saying there was, the story behind it. There's this rich history and the cultural traditions, and, the entire thesis of this podcast is that story is how we connect to the arts and how we make meaning. And so I would love to hear from you any of your favorite stories of, I know it's like asking your favorite child, but,
how many hours do you have?
A good story, because and again, it's one of those things that it's a tradition that's global, and it's sprung up in so many different ways across different cultures. But I would love to get some insights from you about how calligraphy does look different in different cultures, or what are some of the events or people who shaped it, like some of those stories. I would love to hear from you, any one or two that you can bring into it.
Well, if you've got anybody listening who'd like to learn more about American calligraphy, the stories are just amazing, and they will make you proud to be an American. But they'll also make you proud to be a visual artist, because you can see these things when you are told the stories about how to look at them. For instance, 100 years ago, everybody in the United States had to study something called Palmer method. Mm-hmm. The capitals and the very sloping ball and line that nobody could read, including the people who wrote it. But Mr. Palmer had gotten on to teaching this and had patented the materials for teaching it, the workbooks and the pencils, and he even handed out little lapel pins for every grade in grade school. And he gave all the grade school teachers free summer workshops. So, of course, once those got into the public schools, Palmer method never went away. It wasn't a very good method, but it was like typical American story. It was a franchise success. It just kept going and going and going until about 1980, when the fad for calligraphy first brought italic writing to America. And suddenly all these beginners sat up and said, why haven't we been learning this? This is such a better system. And at that point, there was kind of a revolution in learning to write.
Can you tell me, like, what's different? Is it going to be like, are there serifs? Is it sans serif? Like, what's that looking like?
I already need to wave my hands around to try and describe to you how italic is just a more readable and easy to write alphabet. But the main thing is that it's done with the classic calligraphy pen that makes thick and thin lines. And people, I don't know how to describe it, except that people just almost, it's a gut level feeling that this is a beautiful line. And if you look back to the Renaissance, you look back to Gothic manuscripts, they're all done with this pen that has thick and thin lines. Even Roman carved letters have this aspect to them that the stroke gets thick and thin as you move the pen around. You don't have to do anything but just smoothly move the pen. And now that's about all I can say without having the visuals to back me up.
So is that like what I'm thinking of, like when I get out like a chisel tip and I keep it at a maybe 45-degree angle so that it shifts the weight of the line as I'm writing for a smooth stroke, but it shifts the thickness, right? Yeah. And that's the italic that was introduced in the 80s.
And it's taught throughout the rest of the English-speaking world, but somehow Mr. Palmer and his franchise kept America doing this really laborious and not very beautiful or readable letter until italics came in. And I have to say, it was the hobbyists who seized on italic lettering and said, we want this, and because this is what people want to see.
It's hard to imagine the American system. I mean, when you look at everything else we do, our imperial system, rejection of metrics, like I don't know how we could possibly have held on to something that's a little antiquated and awkward. But I guess in the field of calligraphy, we made an exception.
There are parts of calligraphy that we have just fabulously creative letters. So I've also included that in the book.
Now, if I could put you on the spot, I know the most recent book is Learning American Calligraphy, but I know you've also written about calligraphy from other cultures. Can you, in very broad strokes, if you'll tolerate a pun, can you just give us a little bit of an overview of some of the differences in styles in other parts of the world as it sprang up? You know, some of the characteristics or hallmarks that we see as a unique spin from different cultures.
Yeah. One of the biggest divides is between alphabets and then pictures of ideas. And so alphabetic scripts are like Arabic, Russian, Middle Eastern scripts of all kinds, Israeli.
Mm-hmm.
It's a separate script that is an offshoot of the same stem that produced our alphabet. Same way with Arabic. Arabic branched off later. They're done with the broad pen. You can separate them into letters, and with the sort of small detail that they letter from right to left, and we letter from left to right.
Mm-hmm.
It's still an alphabetic system. All of these sort of related alphabets. Then the big divide is between Western scripts and Chinese or Japanese systems of ideographs. That is, instead of spelling out the word for sun, you draw a picture of the sun. And eventually that gets sort of streamlined and turned into a symbol for the sun. And there are a number of systems like that, but they're very different. Calligraphers can learn them all, and you don't even have to get very fluent in the language. You can learn the principles, and it will make your own standard alphabetic letters look much more interesting.
That is interesting. I hadn't thought about it as like the characters developing from symbols of the actual objects, but now as I'm thinking about it, I guess it kind of makes sense when I think about some of the few, and I'm not going to pretend that I can, speak Mandarin or anything, but now I'm thinking about different symbols that I have seen, and it's like, oh yeah, that does kind of look like an abstraction of the sun or a tree or something like that. It's kind of interesting. It's very different ways of approaching it. Now, after the break, we're going to shift gears a little bit because we've been talking broadly about calligraphy traditions in different parts of the world even, but I always like to drill down a little bit into the specifics. So after the break, we're going to talk about you and your process and just like how to make something with calligraphy. Welcome back. I am here still with Margaret Shepherd, a calligraphy artist as well as a writer. Most recent book, Learning American Calligraphy. Check the links in the show notes. But I wanted to talk to you about just your process. I've already admitted calligraphy is kind of a weaker area for me, or I should say an area for growth that I have. But what made you decide that even though you're a practicing calligrapher, you wanted to write and share your secrets. I mean, what's the old expression? Give a man a fish, that guy knows where to go for fish. Teach a man how to fish. You've ruined your customer base. So like, why did you decide to let everyone in on how to do calligraphy?
What happened to me straight out of college, actually in college, people would come up and say, "Can you teach me to do that? I want a letter that way." I didn't know that was something we could learn. So I started teaching because people demanded it. And I've found this my whole life, that calligraphy has this appeal that you can take something that for a lot of us was not very outstanding and turn it into this art that's just as much an achievement as an oil painting or a performance by a ballet dancer or an opera aria. I mean, it just, if you see that possibility in calligraphy, you can make it happen. It can be a fine art. And people sense that. They don't wait for me to say, "Would you like to learn that?" They come up to me just out of the blue sometimes and say, "I want to learn that."
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, when people appreciate what you're doing, I guess it's hard to say no. And if I could get into your specific style and your approach, just can you tell me how you approach it? Because I know you've studied all different sorts of calligraphy, and I've seen some of your work where you've done stuff that you stretch I don't know how to describe it. It's like you stretch the letters so that the letters form an image to, make a cat out of the letters that say cat and stuff like that. Like, how do you approach that? Do you start off with an idea for where it's going to go, sketch like a bounding box for it, stretch the letters, or are you just like somehow manipulating it in your head and you can do it in a quick stroke and it works? Like, what's your process like?
When I'm awake with my eyes open, I'm always looking at letters. Everything that I read, I notice how the letters are made. And even just the back of a cereal box or the morning newspaper, I really pay attention to the letters. I ask myself, who wrote these? Who designed them? What did they think they were doing when they put them in this situation? And then I do this crucial question, which is, what's that letter look like? And once you start asking that, then you've given the letters a sort of life that you yourself can put into them if you want to. Like, I'll look at an A, and 3,000 years ago, maybe the predecessor of that A was the head of a bull, or the letter B might have come from a house, which was the word that they were using back in Sumerian times. But I feel like a letter is just a picture that's waiting to be liberated. And so when I draw a capital, I don't add a leaf to it, or I don't add a flower. That picture is already in there. The letter is turning into a leaf, or it already looks like a flower. I don't have to add that or, make it in the decorations. And in fact, my own work, when I get to make the decisions, my own work is almost completely made of letters. I don't like fancy borders. I don't like pictures or drawings of people or drawings of landscapes. If I want a landscape, I'll arrange the letters to look like a landscape. If I want to draw a horse, I'll arrange the letters to look like a horse. And I could show you half a dozen pieces of art I've done that you couldn't possibly decide whether it's a word or a picture. It's right between in that sweet spot. So I think for a lot of people, that's a challenge they like to face. What can this letter be if I use my creativity on it?
Interesting. So you start off with the letter itself, and you're almost just trying to see what associations can fly from the letter, what springs forth from it, instead of how can I hammer this letter into something else. I think that's there's something almost poetic about that. That idea of, letting the letters and the text grow into and take on its own other form.
It's a little like bringing up children. You can't make them grow up into something. You have to find out what they're trying to be and help them do that. You cannot kind of dictate creativity. You have to find something, a shape already, and kind of encourage it to go the next step.
Oh, I think that for me is the insight of the episode. You have to find what it's trying to be and help it find its next step, its next evolution, but recognize where it's going instead of pushing it. I think that's a great insight that I want to repeat for all of my listeners. And on that topic, because I do have a number of fellow art teachers and aspiring artists who listen to this show, what advice would you give to people who are trying to get into calligraphy? Aside from the conceptual stuff that we just went over, but like in terms of a process, tools, or other bits of advice, wisdom that you've gained, what advice would you offer people who want to improve in that area?
A good piece of advice I got was, when you're starting out, don't ever turn down a job, a freelance job. You never know what you're going to learn from it, and you never know who might see it and then imagine more about what you could do. And you yourself don't know what your talents are. Like I had a routine part of my freelance career where I put the names on diplomas. Mainly my client was MIT across the company. But anytime I could get into that business, it was like getting paid to practice. After about 20 years, I felt like, okay, I've done this enough. I'm not learning anything new. And I moved on to other sort of the teaching and the writing and the exhibiting. But it was good practice. And I suggest any artist who's already thinking about somehow making a career in art, find a way to keep working.
Yeah, I think that is really good advice. Being open to new opportunities is how you discover where you're going. Just as we were talking about with, looking at and seeing where the lines and shapes can develop, taking on those different roles, learning and practicing, that's how you discover where you're going and where your potential is. And I think that is, again, another wonderful insight. And I do want to say another little bit of advice I'm going to give to those who are interested in calligraphy or really any form of art. Take time to learn from those who have done it before. Take time to learn the stories behind it. Whether you do that by listening to a totally adequate podcast that you should leave 5 stars for, or picking up a great book like Learning American Calligraphy. or really pick up the whole series of Learning Calligraphy from my wonderful guests. Thank you so much again for taking the time. Margaret Shepherd, I really appreciate your helping me to grow and learn a little bit more about an art form that I have struggled with.
Well, I wish I could be there to watch how you're doing and make suggestions and encourage you, because it sounds like you've got great potential.
Thank you. I will say I became competent at it. I'm not great with a fountain pen or anything like that. But if you give me a chisel tip marker, I can make something that's decent. Because the old metal ones, they didn't like me very much. But hopefully it's better now. But like I say, I never shied away from a challenge. I always liked a challenge. Art was not something that came naturally to me, but I think that's what intrigued me. I always like, that feeling of success after something was a struggle. That's why I find it so gratifying to be talking to you about something that I did struggle with. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.